Good morning. Good morning to everyone. I, Hiranyachiti Bhargavi, heartily welcome you all on behalf of the History Department of our college to this talk on the theme Ideas of Manliness in Medieval Literary Cultures. For this, we have with us our esteemed speaker, Dr. Pankaj Jha. Dr. Jha is an associate professor at the Department of History, Lady Shri Ram College. His works have been published both in Hindi and English, and his primary research interest lies in the field of literary cultures. He has worked on several languages, including Apabhransh, Maithili, Persian, and Sanskrit. He has produced some significant works, both as translations and and as books and articles, which are published in highly rated peer-reviewed journals. Some of his works include A Political History of Literature, Vidyapati and the 15th Century, and Servants Pasts, Volume 1. He has also been on the editorial board of the highly reputed international journal, Indian Economic and Social History Review. We are really honored to have you, sir. Thank you. I would also like to take this opportunity to ask the participants to keep themselves muted during the talk so that there are no disturbances. You can post your questions in the chat box, which would be read at the end of the session, or you are free to unmute yourself then and ask your questions. With this, I would request Sir to take over the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiranya. That kind of appears a little awkward to be introduced to your own students in your own college, but that's that's part of the process. So we'll have to go through it. So let me start straight away on the theme, and I am proceeding on the assumption that most of you have read the essay around which my talk is proposed to move. But presuming that most of you have read that essay, that chapter in the book, or at least be familiar with its broad contours, I will only briefly summarize that portion of my work to talk about the ideals of manliness, and then we will hopefully have more time to discuss issues if you have any, and go beyond what I have already written and try and look at some other materials from the same time, some other texts that is not dealt with in that chapter, and more specifically make some comparisons to throw these ideals in sharper relief. So let me start with, as usual, with some disclaimers. First of all, what I'm going to talk about is about manliness. It is not about gender in general, which is a much larger, wider, and more complex phenomenon and idea. Secondly, what I'm going to talk about is primarily focused on 15th century. Unlike what the title claims, this is not covering all of medieval India. That's just too wide for me. Frankly, I have not studied all literary cultures of medieval India, which is rich, diverse, too complex, and too wide for me to claim to cover. So I'm not going to cover all of the literary cultures. And I suspect that there would be wider varieties of articulation on manliness across the languages from Assamese to Gujarati and from Malayalam to Kashmiri. My study is focused on just a few languages and a few samplings of the text within those languages. So I will be focusing primarily on Sanskrit, little bit on Persian, and a little on other North Indian dialects, particularly Awadhi, Upper etc. The corpus of regional languages, vernacular articulations on this theme is just too big for me to claim that I'm going to cover all of that. And finally, what I'm going to talk about will be mostly confined to the ideals and not necessarily lived realities. So you should not confuse those ideals with the actual lived realities. We will have occasions, if there is time, and if you have a question regarding that, to talk about possible understanding that we may arrive at as far as lived reality is concerned. But the talk will be focused primarily on the ways in which ideals are articulated, power relations are camouflaged, and a certain set of ideals within a patriarchal ideology, a certain set of ideals on manliness are reaffirmed or simply presumed and taken for granted. So those are the issues that I'm going to talk about. Now, the first thing that occurs to me when I think of manliness in medieval India as a historian is to think about the specificity of it. Because when it comes to gender, when it comes to the idea that men and women have different to perform, it appears that this idea was there since the ancient times at least. So, what is the big deal? I mean, why should we talk? Why should we single out 15th century or even medieval period? Why should we single out certain texts and talk about them? What is the significance of it if gender and patriarchy was always there? So, first of all, I have to justify what is the significance and why one should be devoting time exclusively to a particular period. And my justification primarily lies with the fact that precisely because gender roles and patriarchal power structure appears to be so abiding, it goes without saying that in societies which are so different from each other otherwise, which are so different where their religious practices, where their rituals, where their political traditions, political structures, economic functions and structures, all of these are so divergent. How come patriarchy survives through all of this? And one of the ways in which perhaps one can try and explain it is the ways in which the patriarchal structure keeps changing its forms. In other words, the very apparently trans-historical longevity of patriarchy, the trans-historical longevity of patriarchy actually draws also on the fact that it is extremely historical. In other words, its forms change, its articulations change, the ways in which it is aestheticized and presented change, the ways in which it finds representation in literature and other cultural artifacts also change. And that is why it is important, I think, to talk about gender roles, specifically manliness in 15th century. So, in other words, what I'm trying to suggest here is that different periods will have different ideological formulations, different articulations, and it is important to understand this changing, ever-changing technology of power, because ultimately this is technology of power. It is a technology of power which is extremely complex. So I'm not going to say, maybe I'll start with that, but this is not about, look, this is manliness, XYZ features are there, and you have your manliness for medieval India. No, it actually comes in some other forms. Uh, it comes in different varieties, in different contexts, and in each context, it is camouflaged in different ways. But in 15th century, we also have a significantly unique articulation of manliness, unique as well as unprecedented. Unprecedented not just for India, but perhaps for all of the world literature. Because the text that my talk is going to focus on is a text on masculinity, the first of its kind in any literary culture, let alone Sanskrit, in which it was composed in 15th century in North Bihar by a poet and a scholar and a courtier, a Brahman Pandit called Vidyapati. So that is my justification for talking about manliness in 15th century. That here is a point when someone is talking specifically about concept. Okay. Now that concept, obviously, because we are talking in the English language, and when we are discussing another culture which found its voice in other languages, there is always this gap, the challenge of finding equivalent words and equivalent concepts. So, what are the ideals and ideas that we're looking at? What are the terminologies in which these ideas were captured? The terminologies that we'll be dealing with primarily is Purusharth or Purushat, sorry, not Purusharth, so much as Purushatva, and there is a difference. I'll explain what the difference is in case some of you might not be aware. We'll be talking about Javamardi, or more recently Mardangi, and we'll be talking about what Apabhransh literature called Purisatva, or Avadhi literature simply referred to as Purush. Okay, so we'll be talking about ideals which were captured by these terminologies. So these are the broad outlines of what I'm going to do today. Okay. Now let's start then with the beginning of the story in Purush Pariksha. As most of you would be aware, if you have read that essay, then the book starts with this seed story where there is a king who is looking for a broom for his daughter, and he asks one of his learned ministers to advise him. The minister advises him to look for a man, upon which the king is surprised, and he asks, what do you mean when you say look for a man? And the learned minister says his name, interestingly, is Subuddhi. So you can assume that the minister speaks the voice of the author. So Subuddhi says, well, actually, there are so many creatures who look like men, but they are not men. You have to look for a real man. And then he goes on to elaborate on what he means by real men. He basically classifies them into three. He says they should be Veer, Sudhi, and Savidya. That is, they should be valorous or heroic. They should be Sudhi, that is discerning or intelligent, and they should be Savidya, that is, they should be learned. Okay? The king is not satisfied, and he asks the minister to explain further with examples. The minister seeks to explain this with mythological examples from Treta and Dwapar, but the king is dismissive, and he says, you should give me examples from this world, not from another world, another time, the truth of which does not apply in this world. So the minister, Subuddhi, agrees to give him examples of the three sets of qualities by telling him stories from this world. And what follows is a set of 44 stories, some of which are called Udaharana Katha, example stories, and others are called Pratyudaharana Katha, or counter example stories, meaning the example stories explain how to be a man, and the counter example stories predictably conveys how not to be a man. So there are different classifications. So, for example, the Veer Purush is of different types. Is Dayaveer, Danveer, Yuddhaveer. Then similarly, the Savitya Purush is of different types. The Sudhi Purush is of different types. One who is bright, one who is intelligent, one who is half bright, and half stupid, one who is completely stupid, and so on. So there are people of different orders who are described in three sections of the book, and the fourth section actually is on the four results, the four rewards of being a good man. These four rewards are called dharma, arth, moksha, and kam. Sorry, dharma, arth, kam, and moksha. That's the order in which it is given. Now, let's start with the terminology. The word purushatva, or the quality of being purusharthvan, is basically referring to the idea of the man who is endowed with appropriate qualities. Okay? So, who is a Purush? The word Purush can be understood with reference to the ancient uh, philosophical texts, especially texts which were of ontological exegetical order, and which basically conceptualized Purush in two parallel ways. One was where the Purush was simply seen as power, as the capacity to act upon natural forces, where the concept of Purush was actually contrasted with Prakriti, where Prakriti was seen as the innate, but mostly passive, unless activated, mostly passive force, which was uh, epitomized by the earth itself. But in more general terms, Purush was simply used to refer to the male character. Okay, obviously, the idea of the male character being the active agent cannot be missed here. That the fact that the two words are cognate, and we must always remember the play of language here, because especially in Sanskrit, but also in other languages, especially in Sanskrit, because Sanskrit linguistics, which developed very early in the subcontinent, Sanskrit linguists claimed that knowledge was original. Knowledge was original to Sanskrit. That is to say, the any knowledge which is produced in, constructed in, represented in any other language other than Sanskrit was imperfect, translated, secondary, because all knowledge originally was created by God in Sanskrit. This idea then is built into the lexical frame of the language. In other words, the fact that Purush means male and Purush also means active agent is not incidental. It is it is significant for the Sanskrit knowing man. Okay, and we should keep that in mind. However, the word Purusharth had a different meaning. It didn't refer simply to the quality of being man, but Purusharth referred to three objectives of life, three objectives of a man's life who was ethically oriented. Okay, three objectives. What are these three objectives? The three objectives are Arth, Kam, and Moksha. Okay, so a Dharma Parayan man, that is, an ethically oriented man, would have these three objectives, and these three objectives are called Purusharth. That is, Purush Arth. Arth here refers to the notion of aim, okay, the aims of life, or ideals which are worth fighting for, which are worth struggling for. So a man lives for Arth, Kam, and Moksha. Earth here signifies the material enjoyment of life, the material comforts of life. Kam signifies that which is stylized, which is given to physical pleasures, including erotic and sexual pleasure, but not limited to sexual pleasure. And moksha refers to the idea of salvation uh, uh, after this worldly life. So it is in the context of these three ideals that a man was classically conceived. Now, it is in this context, it is within this context that we need to understand the articulations of maleness in Middle Ages, especially in 15th century in this text. Now, uh, since most of you have uh, hopefully read the essay, I'm not going into the details. I'll just focus on three or four specific broad characteristics or broad issues, and then we can move to other texts. So primarily, what you notice here is the fact that the the story format of the book allows the author to articulate his ideals of manliness within a dialogical context. So instead of simply conveying an idea blandly, like for example some other texts on politics did, instead of conveying the idea blandly that this is how it is and this is how it should be, for example, the Dharma Shastras, the Smritis, would simply state it. Uh, Manusmriti, for example, would simply state that this is how men should be, this is how women should be, this is what needs to be done, and so on. Instead of that, here the author first describes the quality and says, okay, let me tell you a story. The story then exemplifies that quality, and the story being a story will have many characters who would talk to each other, and there will be a kind of moment of suspense before the resolution, and the story then manages to actually convey much more than the basic ideal with which you started. And that is why it is more convincing, but equally it is more interesting and entertaining. Okay, so that structure is very important. Now remember, Purush Pariksha is a katha. This is how it is conceptualized, but it is also a text on niti. In fact, the author mentions at the end that this is a text on dandaniti. Dandaniti is the word from which niti actually has been shortened in the ancient times. Dandaniti literally meant state policy. Okay, now here is an author who is telling you a story on manliness, how to look for the ideal man. But he claims that he is actually writing a book on political ethics, dandaniti, governance. How come the two go together? Now, this actually had a precedence. When, for example, Panchatantra was composed, many of you would have read its seed story, where there is a king who calls he says three, who has three sons, all three of whom are idiots, and they just refuse to learn anything. So he calls his courtiers and asks them for advice on what to do with these sons who just refuse to learn anything at all. And everyone says only one man can help, and that is Vishnu Sharma, the author of Panchatantra. So Vishnu Sharma comes and offers his services. The king says, how will you do this? Because my sons are completely useless and they are they are not they are completely impervious to anything that you tell them. Uh, and Vishnu Sharma says that, but I'm not going to teach them. I'm going to entertain them. I'm going to tell them stories. And before they know, they will know, before they realize it, they would have actually learned the lessons in ethics. And that's how Panchatantra starts. Okay? So, Vishnu Sharma apparently is telling stories, entertaining you, but in the meantime, his agenda is clear. His agenda is to educate you. Education through entertainment. That is precisely what this Katha, Purush Pariksha, is doing. The author is telling stories in order to educate. Okay, why? Uh, Among other things, also because what he wants to convey in an entertaining fashion, and in an oral culture, we know that stories and songs are durable forms of disseminating knowledge, right? So stories are what we remember, songs are what we remember, and that is precisely what Purush Pariksha is doing. He's conveying his ideals in the story forms so that people remember them, circulate them. Okay. Now, the second thing that is most important here, apart from the fact that this is a story, is the fact that why is he, is the question of why is he claiming that this is, text on Niti? And what is its significance for Purush Pariksha? The significance for Purush Pariksha lies in the fact that most of the stories that we hear of here are actually stories in which the protagonists are princes, or at least the story has some kind of relevance for the political order. Okay? In other words, for the author of Purush Pariksha, a Brahman scholar and poet of 15th century North India, the quality of being a good man is indispensable to the stability of political order. In other words, if if a polity lacked a sufficiently large number of men who are devoted to these manly ideals, it's not just him who is going to suffer, but the entire political order would come under stress. In other words, the idea of manliness is woven together with the ideal of political order, and the fate of two appears to be coterminous. If one does well, the other will do well. And this is obvious also from the way in which the entire text is organized. So there is absolutely no doubt, for example, in the mind of the author that politics is something that it's a game that only men play. Okay, uh, in the medieval period Sanskrit text, for example, a 14th century treatise called Rajniti Ratnakar, written in the same region from which Vidyapati came, uh, specifically laid down the law that no woman can ever be appointed a minister. Uh, Sometimes we also, of course, have queens ruling, especially when there is an issue of male succession. But as far as the other positions of power are concerned, there was absolutely no doubt in any theoretician's mind that it could only be men. Okay, so if politics is a game played amongst men, then the role of uh, the man and his virtues become extremely crucial in the way the polity itself succeeds or does not succeed. So, uh, the third issue that I have highlighted and which I would like to take up here again is the way in which the issue of manliness comes to interact also with and intermeshes itself with the social order, particularly the Varna Jati order. So, for example, there are stories in the Purush Pariksha which specifically singles out a particular castes and tries to sort of establish that as far as these groups, these jatis are concerned, it is impossible for anyone to expect the ideal manly conduct. But also, in if you look at the larger context of the stories, the way in which it is framed, the way in which it picks up its protagonists and antagonists, it is clear that most of the protagonists of the stories, the exemplary stories, are upper caste men, usually Brahman or Kshatriya, occasionally a Vanij. But in the case of other protagonists whose jati is not clear, it is there is rarely any indication that any one of them could be lower caste. However, on the other hand, as far as the counterexample stories are concerned, many of the protagonists, the anti-heroes, are actually from the visibly, verifiably lower caste. So quite clearly, what you notice here is a kind of crisscrossing, intermeshing, but also mutually boosting ideologies of the Varna Ashram Dharma with the gender roles, particularly the role of men. So the Jati order, in other words, is also reflected in the way in which manliness is articulated. I must mention here the fact that at one point the minister Subuddhi, who I said perhaps speaks in the voice of the author, the minister says that a Veer Purush could be born in any lineage. Okay, Kule Kutrapi Jaite. That's the word that he used, and the reason why I am quoting from the original is because there has been some confusion about this expression. Only one scholar, who was not a historian but a sociologist, who studied this text at some length, declared that actually Purush Pariksha is taking the idea of manliness beyond uh, norms of birth or social discrimination. Uh, but my study actually suggests otherwise for two reasons. One, this phrase "kulle kutrapi jayate" literally means that anyone could be veer or well-versed, so irrespective of which khandan, which kul one is born in. However, what it does not say but presumes is the fact that the word kul itself, the word kul itself referred to the kul of an upper caste man, and the one of the you know uh, three upper varnas, usually the first two upper varnas, for the simple reason that this is what the political and social unit of thought in Sanskrit literary culture was. So, for example, if you look at the definition of household, uh, grihast ashram or grih, if you look at the definition of grih in the Dharmashastric literature of 15th century, say for example, there is a text called Shudranikam. There is another called Sudrachar Shiromani, written by Krishnadas, Sudranikam, written by Kamlakar Bhatt. They describe the household by mentioning every member of the household, and one of the indispensable members of the household is the das and the shudra. Okay, the shudra obviously here refers to the shudra who is dependent on the grihast's family. That much is obvious from the context. So obviously, this Shudra, who is being mentioned as past part of the Grih, the household, also presumably has his own family somewhere. He also lives somewhere. There is a cottage, or some kind of a shelter for him where he retires for the night, because even during daytime he cannot enter the he cannot cross mostly the threshold of the the grill, that of which he is apparently ritually an indispensable part. So the grill obviously is not inclusive of the place which the Shudra himself occupies with his family. Okay, so the notion of the political subject on whom authority is exercised itself is not just male; it is upper caste male, because others are subsumed under the larger familial structure. Okay, so when we talk about kul, what we are referring to here is that whether you are Suryakul or Chandrakul or Raghukul, it does not matter. You can vie for these ideals of manliness. It is not saying that even if you're born a Chandal, you can vie for the fruits of manliness. There are stories which, in fact, more explicitly lays this out. Okay, so that's the fourth thing. The last thing that, not the last thing, but last but one thing that I want to underline is the fact that articulations of manliness appears to vary across languages and genres and contexts. And here I'm stepping out of Purush Pariksha to explain, for example, the fact that in other genres, the same ideals are articulated somewhat differently. Okay, say for example, Vidyapati's own work, the upper French work, which is called Kirti Leela, which is basically a kind of biographical prashasti, some kind of a biographical panegyric of his patron, Raja Kirti Singh. And that text also starts with two characters talking to each other, this time a male bee and a female bee. This was also a standard trope in Sanskrit literature. And the text starts by with the conversation where the female bee asks the male bee uh, the meaning of life. Okay, marma, huh? Or not life, but the meaning of this cycle of life and birth, sansar. Hmm? And the male bee, always being the wise one, uh, explains that actually the marm, the meaning of the gist of the cycle of life and birth, actually lies in being born a veer, a hero, and then living a life of honor, man. Okay, so if you are born as a veer and then you live the life of man, honor, then that's the gist of life. That's the marm of sansar. Now, interestingly, he goes on to then explain the what exactly he means, and I'll just read out for you. Uh, he says that such a man, the Veer Purush, as it were, is yeah. So he's like he's so Veer that uh, he is a destroyer of his enemy, Shatru Sanhar. Then he is the is the uh, giver who never turns away a supplicant. He never speaks a lie. He's always truthful. Uh, he is he's always given to, or rather, he's very adept in enjoying the pleasures of life.
like Indra. Uh, in his brightness, he is like fire itself. In his beauty, he is like Kamdev himself, that is the god of love, and he never turns away a supplicant that comes again, but he is also the man who is Siddh, that is, who's sort of accomplished in presumably in various arts. And then there are certain other qualities which are more specifically mentioned for Kirti Singh, and we'll skip that. Now, what is interesting here is the fact that there are three things mentioned here which do not occur, in fact, which are obvious omissions in Purush Pariksha, which, mind you, is about maleness. Okay, Kirti Singh's this book, Kirti Lata, is not about manliness. Okay, it has only one page on how to be an ideal man. For Purush Pariksha, the whole book is on manliness, but it does not mention three very interesting things. One, it does not mention the quality of earning. So it never says the man should be rich or should have the ability to earn money or do some meaningful work with which to earn his livelihood, which is mentioned in Kirtilata. Two, that book has nothing on physical beauty or the ability to make love, for example, which was actually in classical Sanskrit plays, for example, it was emphasized a lot. The quality of a man, especially someone from a princely background, included the ability to be a great lover. This was particularly emphasized even in the Middle Ages in Telugu literature, for example, or Sanskrit literature of 16th century emerging from the Nayak context in between the 16th and 18th centuries. But Purush Pariksha has absolutely no mention of it. The author never talks about the looks of the man. And the third thing is, this book, Kirti Lata, also emphasizes another quality, which is the quality of keeping your composure under stress. Okay, what you may call fortitude. Okay, or in the present contemporary parlance, the younger generation would call the quality of being cool. Always keeping your cool. So no matter what happens, you never lose your calm. These qualities are emphasized here. Now, interestingly, these are also the qualities which are mentioned as part of Javamardi. So, for example, the 13th century text by Kai Gavus, which you will find mentioned in my essay, actually talks at length about the ability to keep your composure. Okay, the ability to keep your composure, to keep cool. Fortitude is emphasized, and the quality of fortitude is again emphasized in 16th century by Bayazid when he is comparing Kamran and Humayun. Those parts are also mentioned in my book. So, in other words, there are these specific qualities which are which comes forth in the context of a retelling, which is more political, more directly political, which is talking about an individual, but also significantly in a text which is more easily accessible, which is written in Apabhransh language, and the author himself says that, he doesn't say maybe Sanskrit mein likhta hu, I also write in Sanskrit, but he says that Sanskrit only intellectuals understand, so let me, sing these songs of valor in Desi Bhasa, Des Bhasa. So the point is that as the genres, vidha, change and the language change, the context changes, the articulation of manliness also changes. I'll just add one more point here before I stop and hopefully have some discussions. One of the most important and least worked upon text from the medieval period
about 150 years later than Vidyapati, late 16th century, is Ramcharitmanas. Okay, Ramcharitmanas is particularly important because very much like Panchatantra or Purush Pariksha, people would read it for other values, for devotional regions, or for, as they say, the Mahakavyas are primarily read for enjoyment of rasas, because it has all the rasas. So, it's like what Dharmender said in Sholay: story mein tragedy hai, comedy hai, suspense hai. So, a Mahakavya is a text which has all the rasas. Now, in Ramcharitmanas, the most striking thing about Ram, who is quite clearly, anyone who knows the plot would know that he is represented as Balshali, right? He's a font of power. That's why he's sent to the forest, and that's why he has to enter all the Leela. And one of the most iconic episodes in Ramcharitmanas is the Sita Swayamvar, okay? Misleadingly called Swayamvar because Sita doesn't have any agency there to choose her husband. So it is not Swayamvar. Okay, Swayamvar conveys the ability to choose, where Swayam, the woman Swayam, chooses her husband, but here the woman is kept as a trophy while a contest goes on between men. So when Ram destroys this, breaks the Dhanush, he does it so gently that nobody realizes before it's broken. Okay, and it's with great care that Tulsidas composes this chopai, and it comes as a resolution to a suspense which goes on pages after pages, where enormously built, hugely built men come and are unable to even move the Dhanush. In spite of all of this, Ram is always represented as Sukumar. Okay, so whenever any character is introduced, whether it is Hanuman, Sugriv, Bali, Muni, Kanak, whosoever looks at Ram for the first time, from that person's perspective, Tulsidas would give a nakshik of Ram, a head-to-toe description. So when Sugriv comes in the presence of Ram, he looks at Ram, and what is he thinking? Tulsidas gives a description and says, "Oh God, what a beautiful man." And he's Sukumar, he's gentle, he's delicate. Okay, that's his persona. The later persona of Ram, which calendar art popularized with, in the 1970s and 80s, with the muscular man, is a much later description. Earlier presentations, even in painting of Ram, including in Mughal painting, you would notice that he's always represented as a very delicately framed man. And this is how he is described. He is also described, incidentally, not in line with Purush Pariksha's male as the bunch of qualities that he mentions. He's closer, rather, to the notions of Jamamardi, which is described in 16th century Persian literature. Now, this is a really heretical thing that I'm saying, but the fact is that the representation of Ram in Ramcharitmanas is very different from the way he was represented in, say, Valmiki Ramayana or many of the other Ramayanas which were composed much before Ramcharitmanas. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that irrespective of the specific qualities that you put into the basket, okay, what you ultimately get is, one, an exclusive maleness, two, the male character always being upper caste, three, the character must at any rate preserve social order, okay, which means basically varnashram dharma, okay, four, that these characters are contrasted not just with women in a heterosexual order, they are also contrasted with other lesser men. The lesser men means men of impure occupations, but also means men who are not well groomed even though they are born high. Okay, so that is the contrast. So they are contrasted with animals, okay, with women, with children, with weaker men, and with unethical men, and with lower born men. Okay, so that is the contrast that is created, and the utility of maleness is not just about the ability to win Purusharth, the ability to win Arth, Moksha, and Kam as reward, but also the ability to do larger good and to maintain social order, because the stability of political order cannot, in this rendition, be maintained without establishing the robustness of the masculine character. So I'll stop here, and I would hope that you would have questions.
Thank you, sir, for this enlightening talk. I mean, this was an opportunity for us to peer into various avenues, various texts which have not been talked about much, not even in classroom settings. So it was a very enjoyable journey and very enlightening.
Thank you.
If you all have any questions, you can unmute yourselves or write it in the chat box. I have one question, and I'm not sure if the premise of the question is correct. So, in the meantime, other students can write it while I ask the question. Again, as I said, I don't know if the premise of the question is correct, but as you said that Vidyapati, he doesn't talk about the physical attributes of men, and it's mostly political. So, does he talk about disability anywhere?
No, not directly.
Right.
It doesn't.
So, while others are writing, I also have some questions. May I ask?
Yes, please.
So, sir, you mentioned about the comparisons of men with children and women in these texts to establish their manliness. Can you elaborate a little more upon them?
Yeah. So, for example, there are some very direct contrasts. These are not comparisons. Comparisons are done between equals as far as the author is concerned. But what the author does is, through the story, to establish, he tries to establish a contrast between men and women. So I can tell you, for example, one very interesting, iconic story, a story which has a very charged political meaning today. The story of Jayachand and Muhammad Gauri. So I should have mentioned that many of the protagonists here are actually, not many, but a couple of protagonists are actually Muslim rulers, although other Muslim rulers are also mentioned, and they are invariably mentioned in very good light. So this is a good example to think about. In fact, I am planning to write something about it soon, which is that even though when we think of Middle Ages, we tend to think of Middle Ages today, or at least the political establishment tends to think of it as a fight between Muslims and Hindus. In Purush Pariksha, a number of Muslim rulers are mentioned, but the fault line is not between Hindus and Muslims. The fault line is between the ideal man and the not so ideal man. Okay, and very interesting story that is narrated here is about the story of Shihabuddin Sahawadin is how his name is spelled in Sanskrit. He's referred to as a Yavan king. So in Sanskrit, they often use the word Yavan to refer to Muslim, although Yavan literally referred to the Greeks. So So he says this Yavan king Shahabuddin was trying to defeat Jayachand, and on repeated occasions he was unsuccessful. However, uh, eventually he called his minister and said, "Ki, what is going on, and how can we defeat this man?" And he says, actually, the reason for Jayachand being so formidable is the fact that he has a wise minister called Vidyadhar. So, if there is any way in which you can sort of strike a wedge between Vidyadhar and the ruler, where the ruler stops listening to Vidyadhar, then your work will be done. So, what does Shahabuddin does? What does he do? He changes his makeup, and he once sneaks into the Jayachand household. This is, of course, fantastic. This is not reality, but this is how the story is being, devised for Vidyapati in order to convey what he wants to convey. So Shahabuddin makes his way into the palace, and he is then able to seduce Jayachand's wife. Okay, and Jayachand's wife is madly in love with Shahabuddin without realizing his real identity. And now, basically, Shahabuddin induces the queen to fill the Raja's ears with bad words for Vidyadhar, and hence, with the help of the queen, the Yavan ruler is sort of able to get the better of Jayachand and defeats him in a battle. What is interesting, however, is the way the narrative ends, because in the narrative, in the end, the villain is neither Jayachand nor Shahabuddin. The villain is the queen. Okay, and in the end, when Shahabuddin wins the battle, who does he kill? He kills the queen, saying that it is because of the faithful nature of women like you that political orders fall. Okay, so for as much for Jayachand as for Shahabuddin, the significance of the fact that women are so fallible, so vulnerable, okay, is made apparent for the reader of Purush Pariksha by the author. And there is a slok with which it ends, where it says the slok that is recited incidentally by the Yavan ruler in the story, who says, the slok says basically that rivers and women are very similar in character, because no matter how much you try to take them up, their natural inclination is to go down and down, both physically and obviously in ethical terms. So that is one story which signifies this, but there are many other similar insinuations, both through couplets as well as through turns in various stories where this contrast is drawn.
Thank you, sir. Just as quick remark, because we have to end the session. Now, in Ramcharitmanas, if Ram is termed as Sukumar and all those characteristics, don't you think that some conventionally feminine attributes in literature are attributed to him?
You see, in terms, in superficial terms, yes. In superficial terms, yes. But where